Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the greatest freedom you've ever experienced didn't come from earning more money, achieving a higher position, or finding the perfect relationship. It came from something much simpler. It came from finally belonging to yourself. For many senior men, this realization arrives much later in life, often after decades spent meeting expectations, carrying responsibilities, and putting everyone else's needs ahead of their own. By the time they discover it, they often wish they had understood it years earlier. Society has long measured a man's success by the people who depend on him. First, he is expected to build a career. Then, he is expected to provide for a family, solve problems, make sacrifices, and quietly carry burdens without complaint. Somewhere along the way, many men forget to ask themselves a simple question: what kind of life do I actually want to live? Something remarkable begins to happen after the age of 60. Many men stop chasing approval and start searching for peace. They begin realizing that being single is not automatically a sign of loneliness, failure, or rejection. In many cases, it becomes the first opportunity they've had in decades, music, to live according to their own values instead of everyone else's expectations. Today, we're going to explore why so many single senior men describe this stage of life as the most peaceful, confident, and fulfilling chapter they've ever experienced. Once you understand the hidden psychology behind this transformation, you may never look at independence or growing older in quite the same way again. For most of a man's life, noise becomes so normal that he stops noticing it. There are responsibilities waiting the moment he wakes up, decisions that affect other people, expectations he feels obligated to meet, problems that somehow become his responsibility to solve. Over time, this constant pressure becomes part of his identity. And because it builds gradually, many men never realize how much of themselves they've lost beneath it. Then something unexpected happens. The responsibilities begin to change. Children become adults. Careers slow down or come to an end. The need to constantly prove yourself starts fading. And for the first time in decades, many men find themselves with something they haven't experienced: music in years. Silence. At first, that silence can feel unfamiliar. Some even mistake it for loneliness because they've spent so many years believing that being alone automatically means something is missing. But after a while, many discover that silence isn't empty at all. It's peaceful. Without constant emotional demands competing for his attention, a man begins hearing his own thoughts more clearly. He starts asking questions he never had time to ask before. What genuinely makes me happy? What kind of people do I actually enjoy being around? What am I no longer willing to tolerate? Those answers don't arrive overnight, but they become easier to hear when life is no longer filled with constant distractions. That clarity changes everything. A man who understands himself no longer feels the need to chase approval or live according to someone else's expectations. Instead, he begins making decisions that protect his peace. And for many senior men, that becomes one of the greatest freedoms they have ever experienced. As that clarity grows, another transformation begins taking place, one that many senior men never expect. They begin experiencing a level of peace they haven't felt in years. Not the kind of peace that depends on circumstances going perfectly or everyone around them being happy, but a deeper peace that comes from no longer carrying emotional weight that was never truly theirs to begin with. Many men spend decades believing that sacrifice is simply part of being a good partner. They learn to avoid unnecessary conflict, stay quiet to keep the atmosphere calm, and place their own needs at the bottom of the list. While compromise is a natural part of any healthy relationship, constantly living in a state of emotional tension slowly takes its toll. The stress doesn't always announce itself. Instead, it quietly builds over the years until it begins affecting a man's energy, his patience, and even his health. When that constant pressure disappears, something remarkable happens. The mind begins to settle, sleep becomes deeper, simple moments become enjoyable again. A morning coffee tastes different when it isn't interrupted by anxiety. An evening walk feels more meaningful when your thoughts aren't consumed by problems waiting at home. Many senior men say they didn't realize how emotionally exhausted they had become until they finally experienced life without that constant tension. This piece isn't about escaping responsibility or avoiding relationships. It's about discovering that life doesn't have to feel like a permanent emotional negotiation. Once a man experiences that kind of calm, he begins protecting it with intention. He becomes far more careful about who he allows into his life because he understands that real freedom isn't found in having more people around him. It's found in preserving the peace he worked so hard to regain. Something else begins changing once a man discovers that kind of peace. His energy starts coming back. This isn't simply about feeling less tired at the end of the day. It's about recovering the emotional energy that has been quietly drained over years of carrying stress, meeting expectations, music, and constantly adapting to other people's needs. Many senior men don't realize how much energy emotional tension consumes until it finally disappears. Stress has a way of aging a man that has nothing to do with birthdays. Music. It affects the way he sleeps, the way he thinks, and even the enthusiasm he brings to everyday life. Over time, many simply accept this as a normal part of getting older. They assume feeling exhausted is inevitable, but often it isn't age that's stealing their vitality. It's music, the weight they've been carrying for far too long. Once that weight is lifted, many men experience a surprising sense of renewal. They find themselves waking up with more motivation. They begin taking longer walks, exercising more consistently, traveling to places they've always wanted to see, or returning to hobbies they abandoned years ago because life became too busy. Some reconnect with old friends, others discover completely new interests that give them a fresh sense of purpose. The remarkable part is that none of this happens because someone else changed their life. It happens because they finally have the physical and emotional space to invest in themselves again. That renewed energy doesn't just make life more enjoyable. It reminds a man that growing older doesn't have to mean growing smaller. In many ways, this stage of life becomes an opportunity to feel more alive than he has in decades simply because his energy is finally flowing toward his own life, instead of being constantly pulled in every direction. As a man begins reclaiming his energy, he also starts recovering something that many people don't even realize can be lost: music. He recovers his dignity. This isn't the kind of dignity that comes from wealth, status, or recognition. It's the quiet confidence that comes from living according to your own values instead of constantly trying to meet someone else's expectations. Throughout life, many men gradually become accustomed to seeking approval. They work harder to avoid criticism, explain themselves more than they should, and spend years trying to keep everyone around them satisfied, music, without noticing it. They begin measuring their worth by how useful they are to other people. The problem with living that way is that your sense of value is always being decided by someone else. Many single senior men describe a completely different experience. They wake up each morning without feeling the need to justify their decisions, defend their choices, or seek permission to enjoy their own lives. They spend their time with people who genuinely respect them and quietly distance themselves from those who constantly bring unnecessary conflict or negativity. Over time, this changes the way they see themselves. Instead of asking whether they're meeting someone else's standards, they begin asking whether they're living up to their own. That simple shift is incredibly powerful because it places control back where it belongs. A man who respects himself no longer feels pressured to tolerate situations that rob him of his peace. Music. He becomes more selective about where he invests his time, his attention, and his emotions. Perhaps that's one of the greatest gifts of growing older. You eventually realize that dignity isn't something another person can give you. It's something you protect through the choices you make every single day. And once you begin living that way, your entire outlook on life begins to change. As a man grows older and begins living on his own terms, he starts noticing something he rarely appreciated when he was younger: time feels different. For decades, his schedule was shaped by responsibilities. There were careers to build, children to raise, bills to pay, family obligations to meet, and countless commitments that demanded his attention. His days belonged to everyone else before they ever belonged to him. By the time he reached the end of each week, there was often very little time left for the things he genuinely wanted to do. That changes once he enters this new stage of life. Many single senior men discover that time becomes one of the greatest luxuries they have ever owned. They no longer feel pressured to organize every day around someone else's plans or expectations. They can wake up early to watch the sunrise, spend an afternoon reading a book, take a spontaneous road trip, or simply enjoy an evening of complete silence without feeling guilty for doing so. What makes this freedom so valuable isn't the activities themselves, it's the ability to choose them. Choice is something many people underestimate until they've spent years living without it. When every decision requires negotiation or compromise, even the smallest pleasures begin feeling like obligations. But when a man regains control of his own time, in music life becomes surprisingly simple again. He begins noticing the little moments that once passed him by. A peaceful morning walk, a conversation with an old friend, learning a new skill, or sitting quietly with his thoughts suddenly becomes deeply satisfying. After 60, many men realize that the richest life isn't necessarily the busiest one. It's the one where your time finally belongs to you, and you have the freedom to spend it in ways that genuinely bring you peace and music fulfillment. As men spend more time living independently, another transformation begins to unfold, and it may be one of the most important of all. They develop emotional independence. This isn't about becoming cold, distant, or incapable of loving other people. It's about reaching a point where your emotional stability no longer depends on someone else's approval, attention, music, or presence. For many senior men, this is the first time in their lives they experience that kind of freedom. Others begin learning new skills, volunteering in their communities, mentoring younger men, or investing time in creative passions they never had the chance to explore. The activity itself isn't what matters most. What matters is that every decision is driven by personal purpose rather than obligation. That sense of direction changes the way a man sees himself. He no longer feels as though life is winding down. Instead, it feels as though a new chapter has finally begun. Rather than looking back at what he has lost, he begins looking forward to what he can still build. When a man is younger, much of his identity is often tied to the roles he plays. He's expected to be a provider, a husband, a father, or the person who holds everything together. While those responsibilities can be meaningful, they can also cause a man to lose sight of who he is outside of them. He becomes so focused on taking care of everyone else that he rarely has the opportunity to understand himself. Living independently changes that. A man learns to enjoy his own company without feeling the need to escape it. He discovers that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. He becomes comfortable making decisions on his own, solving problems calmly, and facing life's challenges without immediately looking for someone else to carry the emotional weight. Music. That quiet self-reliance gradually becomes confidence. Ironically, this is often when other people begin seeing him differently. Confidence that grows from emotional independence doesn't seek attention because it doesn't need to. It's calm, music steady, and authentic. A man who is genuinely comfortable with himself approaches relationships from a position of choice rather than dependence, and that changes every interaction he has. Instead of searching for someone to complete his life, he simply looks for people who make an already meaningful life even better. As that emotional independence grows stronger, many senior men begin noticing another unexpected change. They stop living according to other people's expectations and start creating a future that genuinely reflects who they have become. For the first time in decades, they have the opportunity to ask themselves a question that was often buried beneath responsibility. How do I want to spend the years I have left? For Much of life, the answer to that question is influenced by other people. Career decisions are shaped by financial obligations. Free time revolves around family responsibilities. Even simple choices like where to live, how to travel, or what hobbies to pursue often require compromise. While those sacrifices may have been necessary during earlier stages of life, many senior men discover that this new chapter offers something they haven't experienced in years: complete freedom to choose their own direction. Some finally take the trip they postponed for decades.